one of the great things about Starlink is it's very difficult to jam. There's a couple of very expensive EW systems that can jam it, but there's maybe one or two actually in the whole of Ukraine on the Russian side. But generally, it's very, very difficult to jam. It's very fast. And yeah, it's been used very effectively by the Russians and by the Ukrainians, and now the Russians can't use it. So that's a significant boost for the Ukrainians, and the chaos that this created, this sudden lack of communication created on the Russian side, has led the Ukrainians to be able to mount some small counteroffensives. They've taken a number of villages. They've pushed back in Zaporizhia and also in Donetsk as well. So it's not going particularly well for the Russians at the moment, although they are still advancing in other areas of the front.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we are speaking to Jimmy Rushton. He joins us from Kyiv, Ukraine, and is a geopolitics and security analyst. Jimmy, thank you very much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me back.
Well, Jimmy, I imagine that no one where you are is now going to be expecting an election anytime soon, are they?
No. It's slightly surreal, given that we're still experiencing, nearly daily air raids, and that's just in the capital, let alone other parts of the country which are closer to the front line. And the idea that you could run any form of meaningful election here is very, very strange, not least because Russia has, said that they'll give a potential ceasefire, but only on the day of polling. So the idea that, again, you could run any form of hustings, campaigning, anything that would make an election meaningful, because it's not just about the vote, it's about the whole process of an election. So it's about challenging candidates on their policy platforms and their records. And you really can't do that under martial law. You can't do that with near constant airstrikes, missile strikes, drone strikes. It's farcical, to be honest.
And we've seen perhaps some sign of why Russia has been so insistent on the idea of elections. They're now talking about how they want Ukrainian citizens in what they call Russian territory and what they call Ukrainian citizens to be able to vote in an election, or they're voicing concerns about that idea. The idea that anyone who is living in Russia would be able to vote in a Ukrainian election is surely for the birds.
It's a very strange position to have, that you claim that this territory is now Russia, but that the people living there are Ukrainians. Surely that would suggest that the territory isn't Russia and the territory is Ukraine, and the people that are living there should be able to decide the future of their own country, which is, has been completely denied to them. Russia obviously claimed that they ran referendums, but I've spoken to people that voted in those referendums and they were forced to vote at gunpoint. When I visited Kherson in November 2022, I spoke to some people there, and they told me that Russian soldiers came around with ballot boxes, armed Russian soldiers with ballot boxes, and watched them as they voted. So the idea that these territories claimed to, the claim that these territories joined Russia willingly is nonsensical. A lot of the population obviously couldn't vote at all because they'd already left. So yeah, it's farcical, but it's what we've come to expect from the Russians. They don't operate in good faith ever, and this is just it's designed to destabilize Ukraine. It's designed to put unrealistic and objections in front of any form of peace deal, because fundamentally they don't want any peace. They're just doing enough to persuade the Americans that they're not an obstacle to peace, whilst making it practically impossible for the Ukrainians to agree.
And we've also seen speeches coming out of the Munich Security Conference over the weekend, most importantly, Marco Rubio. There was still a lot of that language that the current administration likes to focus on, this idea that Europe is in decline, and trying to tie that to the idea of immigration. At the same time, Marco Rubio did seem to have a much more conciliatory tone than we've seen out of the administration and some of its officials in Europe. Does this also suggest perhaps that figures like J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth are slightly taking a back seat when it comes to European policy?
I mean, who knows? It just entirely depends on which member of the administration is speaking on any given day. There's no coherent policy throughout the administration. Marco Rubio will say one thing, which will seem to be more conciliatory, and then J.D. Vance will come out the next day and say something completely different. You'll have this board of peace that Trump set up, and then they'll change the name of the Defense Department to the Department of War. Well, they've changed the branding. The actual name is can't be changed unless Congress votes on it. But it's just this really schizophrenic, just divided policy coming out of the administration, and it makes it very difficult for America's allies to really know, what America is going to be thinking on any given day of the week. There's no consistency, and it's very difficult to make strategic planning when your ally is so unpredictable and so erratic, which America is at the moment, unfortunately.
And of course, the security conference was dominated by the issue of whether or not there is some way to peace in Ukraine. At the heart of that at the moment is the US security guarantees. What is Kiev saying is missing from those guarantees at the moment for Ukraine to feel that there is a possibility of ending this war without simply letting Russia restart it?
Well, it's really difficult to know because from the Ukrainian perspective, any agreement with Russia is essentially worthless because Russia will say till they're blue in the face that they didn't plan to invade Ukraine, as they were saying before February 2022. We don't plan to invade Ukraine. This is hysterical Western propaganda, and then they'll turn around and invade Ukraine. Um, so how can you believe anything that a country that lies so systematically, deliberately says? Well, the only way you can believe it is if there's a credible military threat deterring them. So for the Ukrainians, there needs to be a credible military threat to deter Russia. Without that, nobody believes that Russia would agree to any peace deal, because fundamentally Russia still wants the whole of Ukraine. They want to dominate Ukrainian politics in the same way they dominate politics in Belarus, and now Georgia, for example. They want a puppet government here, or they want to just subsume the country entirely into Russia, as they've done in these four oblasts of Ukraine. So it's still fundamentally unrealistic. These talks of security guarantees that Ukrainians just don't believe. That, to be honest, Western countries don't believe as well. This fanciful notion that the British government is going to deploy troops to Ukraine, and you had John Healey in Kyiv recently, and he was talking about devoting some funding to prepare British troops for such a mission, and nobody believes this will ever happen. It's just I speak to people in the British government; they don't believe this is going to happen. It's just window dressing. It's theatre, and that lack of realism, unfortunately, which has underpinned every stage of these negotiations, which is so exhausting, I think, for the Ukrainians, because fundamentally they believe that Russia will only come to the table in a meaningful way when they feel that they can't gain more on the battlefield than they can in the negotiations. At the moment, they still believe that they can conquer more territory of Ukraine. They're paying a horrendous price for that territory that they're taking, but they're still taking territory mostly. So yeah, it's fundamentally unrealistic, and it's just. I was discussing this with a Ukrainian friend the other day. I had to explain to her what the term Groundhog Day meant because she hadn't seen the film. But I was like, it's Groundhog Day. It's the same thing over and over again with slight variations. So yeah.
And meanwhile, in Russia, we also heard over the weekend evidence coming out of European nations that the Russian dissident Navalny, who died in Russian prison, was likely poisoned using a dart frog poison. There's presumably no surprise among the analysts who have been watching Russia for some time that it's likely that the Kremlin was behind his murder.
No surprise. I think they used this particular type of poison because they thought it would potentially go unnoticed. Putin does this funny little dance that he wants people to know that he's essentially killed people, but he doesn't want it to be too obvious. So if you look at, say, Western propagandists for Russia in our media or online, they like to pretend and maintain this fiction that Russia is not this autocratic state ruled by a dictator who murders his political opponents. And the way they do that is by retaining some level of plausible deniability when they kill people. Same with Nemtsov. Same with Navalny. Same with even Prigozhin, for example. They blew his aircraft up, but they didn't allow a proper investigation. So Putin was just a malfunction. His plane just exploded in midair, as planes tend to do in Russia. But it's this kind of nod and a wink to the removal, the murder of these political opponents. And yeah, I don't think anyone was surprised that this happened. I think it was obvious. I think it's important that there's evidence, and this statement from the British government was supported by a number of other European countries. They released a joint statement saying that this was the cause of his death. But yeah, it's just another one of Putin's opponents that he's murdered.
And we've also heard out of Russia over the weekend, Valery Gerasimov, one of the senior generals in Russia, visiting troops and claiming that Russia's seized what they've called a handful of villages in Ukraine in February. Is that enough, though, given Russia's losses? These gains that the Russians make quite a lot of.
No, it's not enough. And right now, the Russians are having a difficult time because they've had the Starlink satellite communication system turned off relatively effectively, and almost overnight. Ukraine implemented this whitelisting system with SpaceX. So if you're a Ukrainian soldier or if you're a Ukrainian volunteer and you've got a Starlink system, you can now register it with the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. And if you don't register your Starlink, it just won't work within the borders of Ukraine. So Russia had been relying on Starlink for a lot of its battle fleet communications, and now they just don't work. They relied on them for piloting some of their long-range aerial drones and some of their ground drones, and they don't work anymore. So this has been really disruptive for the Russians. And at the same time, the Russian government has banned or heavily restricted Telegram, which is also Telegram is a popular Russian messaging app, which doesn't really get that much use in the UK, but in the post-Soviet space in Ukraine, Russia, etc., it's ubiquitous. Everyone uses it. So a lot of military activities in Russia is coordinated on Telegram, even though it's not secure, and it's always been heavily suspected that the Russian security services have had access to it. But even that level of access has not been enough. So the Russian government is pushing Russians to move over to this new app called Max, which is developed by the Russian government and is heavily controlled. It's essentially a version of the Chinese WeChat. That's the idea. It's this kind of ubiquitous everything app that's designed to be heavily monitored, and they can crack down on dissent very, very easily. They could do that with Telegram, but not quite as easily. And again, that just demonstrates the kind of total control that Putin wants to have over his people, even people in his military, which he doesn't always trust the military. He has some of the most trenchant critics of his rule, even though they are ultra nationalist critics, are from military circles sometimes.
And Russia has tried to rebuild their own Starlink system. They've launched something called the Barrage 1 unmanned stratospheric platform. Is there any sign that's going to be able to patch up the loss of Starlink, or that the Russians have any technology that can replace that system?
No, that's an aerostat. That's a big balloon with a 5G repeater on it. That's not new. In fact, the Ukrainians have been doing something relatively similar. More impressively as well, there's a Ukrainian company called Aerobavona. They've done some very interesting things with balloons. No, it's at best, a band-aid on a gaping open wound, and it's nowhere near as good as Starlink. One of the great things about Starlink is it's very difficult to jam. There's a couple of very expensive EW systems that can jam it, but there's maybe one or two actually in the whole of Ukraine on the Russian side. But generally, it's very, very difficult to jam. It's very fast. And yeah, it's been used very effectively by the Russians and by the Ukrainians, and now the Russians can't use it. So that's a significant boost for the Ukrainians. And the chaos that this created, this sudden lack of communication created on the Russian side, has led the Ukrainians to be able to mount some small counteroffensives. They've taken a number of villages. They've pushed back in Zaporizhia and also in Donetsk as well. So it's not going particularly well for the Russians at the moment, although they are still advancing in other areas of the front.
And there are reports that Russia is changing the way it recruits for its ongoing conflict in Ukraine, replacing its sort of biannual draft with a rolling draft. What does this tell us about the situation and the need for troops that Russia has in this conflict?
So the majority of Russian soldiers that fight in Ukraine are not actually draftees; they're volunteers, and they've been incentivized to volunteer via large signing bonuses. There is some evidence that that is not as persuasive as it was, or that all the people that would be willing to sign up for these bonuses have now signed up, and the life of an average soldier in Ukraine is not long. They, these people live short, brutal lives when they come to Ukraine. So what the Russians are doing is they're heavily recruiting from overseas. There have been multiple cases where individuals from sub-Saharan Africa particularly have been lured to Russia on promises of employment and then forced to sign military contracts. And again, these people are used as completely disposable cannon fodder. In one case, relatively recently, one African soldier, I think he was from Kenya, he was shown the Russians had strapped a TM-62 anti-tank landmine to his chest and used him essentially as a involuntary suicide bomber to storm Ukrainian positions. And you can search for this online. You can see videos of this, and they were shouting racial epithets at him as they pushed him towards the front. So this is the kind of people the Russians are, and they want manpower. They don't really care where they get it from. If they can, get some poor African mercenaries, or even not mercenaries, people that are recruited through, subterfuge, they don't care. They have no moral problem with that at all.
And on the other side of this conflict, of course, Ukraine is still facing probably one of the harshest winters it has in this war. What are the conditions like in Kyiv now? And is there a sign of an end to this harsh winter and the energy crisis Ukraine's been facing?
Yeah, so conditions are definitely better. A couple of weeks ago, it was down to -28, which is astonishingly cold. You get hypothermia in minutes rather than hours in that sort of temperature. It was actually colder in Kyiv than it was at the North Pole, which is an astonishing fact, really. But yeah, no, it's gotten warmer now. Today is only the low today is only -13. It's about -7 at the moment. So I mean, for British audiences, that seems very, very cold. But I can tell you, after you've experienced temperatures of -28, -7 feels really, really warm. In terms of the power, it's gotten better, but it's still, I don't have power at the moment. I'm running my light on a power bank. We have maybe 6-7 hours of power a day now, which is up from about 2 hours when it was really, really bad. We don't have any heating. We have water, thankfully, but there are lots of buildings in Kyiv that are still without water, without power, and without electricity. So it's still very difficult here. But there is a feeling that we're kind of over the hill, and I think what the Russians seem to think is that if they put enough pressure on the Ukrainian people, they'll storm the Rada and demand that the government signs a peace deal, and that's just not how Ukrainians think at all. At all.
There has, of course, been a response from the Ukrainians, though, not one that necessarily threatens to collapse the military effort in any way. It's important to add. But Herman Galushenko, the former energy minister, has reportedly been arrested trying to cross the Ukrainian border. Is there a sign in there that the anti-corruption authorities do now have the kind of space and authority needed to work towards some level of justice, if that's what's needed?
I mean, they always have. One of the intriguing things about Ukraine is that although obviously this country has historically had problems with corruption, the anti-corruption authorities here are very powerful, and they are genuinely independent from the executive. Unlike, for example, in the United States, there are no presidential pardons that can just magically appear when a friend of the president has put his hand in the cookie jar. So this is a good sign. Corruption is a cancer at the best of times. It's absolutely more of a cancer during wartime. And yeah, I think it's a sign that the state is working effectively. Obviously, there needs to be more anti-corruption investigations. Anyone that has stolen money from the Ukrainian people should end up in jail. And I think that's if you speak to Ukrainians, they are furious about corruption. The idea that these people are stealing money from the Ukrainian people when soldiers have to fundraise everything from tourniquets to pickup trucks to eco-flows. It's incredibly, and it makes Ukrainians furious fundamentally.
And as you mentioned before, there are some of these Ukrainian counterattacks taking advantage of the Starlink confusion in Russia. Some counterattacks near Kyiv have retaken some small settlements. Is there any sign of Ukraine breaking that grinding sort of trench-like warfare, though?
No, these counterattacks are at a tactical level, and they are localized, but they're still significant because essentially what you've seen is instead of Russia continuously advancing in most places along the front, you're seeing Ukraine pushing them back. And probably more significant was just before Christmas, you saw a very successful Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kupiansk, where Second Hearty Corps managed to outflank the Russians and humiliate Vladimir Putin because he'd announced the capture of the city just a couple of weeks before. But I think what this proves is that this war is not decided, and that anyone that says Ukraine has just been defeated and should surrender is clearly wrong, because there are things that the West can do, like cutting Russia off from Starlink, that have significant impact on the ground here. And I think we should be smart at identifying areas of Russian weakness and, putting pressure on those areas of Russian weakness.
Well, Jimmy Rushton, geopolitics and security analyst, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Frontline. For all the latest updates on the war in Ukraine and global security, you should subscribe to this channel. You can also hear us on Times Radio's overnight programming, and you can also find us wherever you get your podcasts. Remember, for the latest news and analysis, you can listen to Times Radio, or you can read the latest news at thetimes.com, and you can go over and subscribe to the Times YouTube channel for the latest news and analysis on all global news updates. Remember, for the latest on US news, you can listen to the Trump Report wherever you get your podcasts, or subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time.